When working with Canvas apps connected to SharePoint lists, a big limitation is the quantity of records that can be returned to our apps by using the SharePoint built-in connection. And the idea of this video is to show you how to retrieve as many records as you need by using Power Automate and the SharePoint REST API. If you prefer, you can also follow along with these instructions from a blog post that I wrote about this same topic. You can find a link to this blog and to my complete Power Automate course in the video description. So here we are at the Power Apps Studio, and by default, Canvas apps can read up to 500 records from any data sources. But you can easily increase this limit to 2000 records if you just go to the app settings and modify this data row limit field. In this example, we are reading data directly from a SharePoint list and assigning it to a collection called Employees Snapshot, which is the source used for this gallery over here. And this gallery is currently displaying 500 records, but if I come here to the preview the app and refresh it, you see that it now will display 2000 items. And I can tell you because I have this label at the top, which is simply counting the quantity of records that exist inside this gallery. So the problem here is that I'm reading data from this employees large company SharePoint list, which has in fact a total of 10,000 records, but only 20% of my items are currently being displayed into this gallery. So let's solve this problem. And Power Apps has this restriction popularly known as delegation limit, where only a snapshot of the data source is retrieved by a formula. And an easy solution here is to just transfer this data source reading task to Power Automate flows instead of calling the connector directly from Power Apps. And I have an example like this right here into this other screen where I can just click a button that executes a Power Automate flow in the background and retrieves the 10,000 records from SharePoint. Now, if you're already familiar with Power Automate, you might think that the get items action is the obvious solution for this problem, and you are not totally wrong. This is actually the best approach if you are working with up to 5,000 list items. And here, into this sample flow, you can see what I mean. So the first get items is reading 5,000 records from the employees list and is getting a response in only 8 seconds, which is pretty decent. But once you try to read the entire list, it will take more than 2 minutes to execute this same operation, which is not feasible for the scenario since it has a bad user experience and the flow will be timed out after a couple minutes by Power Apps. And another thing that I have here into this flow is this send an HTTP request to SharePoint action, which took only 2 seconds to be executed and returned a subset of 5,000 records from the employees list. This second HTTP request is very similar to the first one and retrieves the rest of the items from the same SharePoint list. So by adopting this strategy, I can have my 10,000 list items in only 3 seconds. Let's now see how to replicate this same logic in a flow that can be called from Power Apps. So here I already have this very simple flow containing only when a Power Apps calls a flow trigger and a response to a Power App or flow action. The entire logic of this automation will be placed between these two steps, and you can start by adding a send an HTTP request to SharePoint action. And here, the first thing we need to inform is the SharePoint site to where we want to send the HTTP request to. And in this case, it must just match the same SharePoint site where the list is stored. Next, we need to provide an HTTP method, and for this case, we'll just stay with the get. And then in the URI parameter, we need to inform the relative path to where we want to send the HTTP request. In this case, I will start by saying /_API/web/lists/get_by_title. And now here, I will need to open parentheses and also single quotes. And then I will provide the name of the list that I want to access between these parentheses and single quotes. And I'll just finalize that with items. Now here, I just need to provide, as I said, the same name of the list that I want to read. In this case, it's just employees dash large company, so I will pass this value inside the parentheses and the single quotes. And at this point, our URI is already good enough to retrieve the SharePoint list items, but if we just leave it as it is, we'll get only 100 records from this request. So to make sure that we will receive 5,000 records instead, I will just need to include a query to this endpoint. So just say question mark, a dollar sign. I will write top equals 5,000. Here I can pass any quantity up to 5,000. This endpoint doesn't support more than 5,000 records per request, so I could also keep including other queries here if I wanted to, but I'll just leave it as it is to keep things simple. By the way, I'll leave this entire query in the video description for reference, along with other resources. And one last thing to do for this HTTP request is to configure its headers. So let's come to the advanced parameters and enable the headers. And then here I will start by including the accept, and I'll say application/JSON. And as a second header, I will include OData, and I'll say no metadata. So this configuration here for the headers is required to make sure that we will receive the response from the SharePoint in simplified JSON format. Now, for retrieving more than 5,000 records, we need to use a second HTTP request to SharePoint. And at this time, we need to access an endpoint dynamically. If you come back to this other flow as an example, we will see in the HTTP response this OData next link property, which is exactly what we need to access to get the next page of records. This property can be found in all subsets of records until you get to the last page of the list. So in this second request, for example, you'll notice we don't have the OData next link property since there are no more items to be retrieved from this list. And because we want to create a solution that works for a variable quantity of records, we need to rely on a do-until loop that will be executed while the OData next link property is present in the HTTP responses from SharePoint. So before creating this loop, let's start by initializing two variables after the HTTP request. The first I will call next page. I'll set its type to string, and I'll use an expression to assign its value to the OData next link property from the HTTP request body. The second variable is called all records. It has an array data type, and I'll set its value to the body value property from our SharePoint action. Now I can include the do until loop, and for the loop condition, I'll add an expression to test if the next page variable is empty. So just say empty, and I'll select the next page variable's dynamic content. I will leave this dropdown to is equal to, and here I'll just say true. So once this next page variable is empty, this loop will stop. I can also modify the count property. If needed, this sets the maximum quantity of iterations for this loop, which can be helpful to avoid any accidental infinite loops. But for this case, I'll just leave it as it is. And now I can just copy this HTTP request action and paste it inside the loop. And here, the only thing that we need to change is the URI, so it references to the next page. And the URI for the next link is currently stored under the next page variable, but we first need to perform a small transformation into this text. And this is because the OData next link property retrieves the full path to where we should direct our next request, as you can see here. But Power Automate expects only the relative path, excluding the SharePoint site reference, which is already informed in the action. So for that, we can use the text expression. So just remove this entire URI from here, and I'll include a replace expression. For the first parameter, I'll just use the next page variable reference. For the second parameter, I will come to my SharePoint list, And I'll copy the site URL, so everything that is before these lists over here, and I'll now paste it as a string as a second parameter. And as a third parameter, I will just leave an empty string. So what's happening here is that we are taking the URI for next page, and we are just replacing this base URL that is referencing the site for an empty string, which will leave us with this relative URI. Now, no further changes are required for this HTTP action, so inside the loop, I will include a set variable action, and I'll select the next page variable, and I'll overwrite it with the ODERA next link property from the second HTTP request action. And be careful here because we have two actions that are pretty similar, the send HTTP request to SharePoint and the send HTTP request to SharePoint 1. So the second is the one that I want to select. Basically, what I want is to select the one that is inside the do until loop. So be careful because the names are pretty similar for these two actions. And another thing to be careful here is to include a question mark before the ODERA next link reference. This will ensure that a null value is assigned to the next page variable in case the property is missing from the SharePoint's response. Next, I'll include a compose and I'll use a union expression to combine the allRecords variable with the body value outputs from the loop's HTTP response. So what's happening here is that we are taking whatever already exists into the allRecords variable and adding the SharePoint's response to it. And then we just need to take these compose outputs and overwrite the allRecords variable, so it will now also hold the items from the iterated list page. One last step in the flow is to send the list records to Power Apps. So here at the respond to a Power App or flow action, I will create a new property called results, and I will select that as a text type. And as a value, I will add an expression since I need to convert this array of objects stored into the allRecords variable as a text. So I'll just say string, and I'll pass between the parentheses the allRecords variable. I can now save this flow. And one last thing that we need to do is to change the run only settings so the flow will use the maker's credentials to fetch SharePoint. So I'll just come back to the flow details page and I will scroll down until the run only user section. And here I'll click edit. I'll set the SharePoint to use my own connection and I'll click save. And now everything is ready, so let's come back to Power Apps, and I'll now go to Power Automate. Here I will include a new flow into my app. I'll select Delegation Limit, which is the flow that I just created. And after it loads, I will just edit this All Flow button to include the Delegation Limit flows reference. Now let's save it and let's test it. So I will execute the app in preview. I will clear my collection and I will click the All Flow button again. And now, as expected, after a few seconds, the flow populates the collection with the 10,000 records being later displayed in the gallery. And if you now come back to our Automate Flow Details page and refresh the flow run history, you'll see this flow took only 6 seconds to run. So in summary, this approach overcomes the delegation limit for Canvas app requests to SharePoint while ensuring a quick retrieval of thousands of records that doesn't negatively impact the user experience or risks a timeout for the automation.